Congratulations. You've just woken up in the middle of a Viking longhouse, sometime around 872 AD. The good news? You're not dead yet. The bad news? You're lying on a bed of straw that's actively trying to stab you, sharing it with 3 unwashed relatives, and a goat named Bjørn, who won't stop chewing your hair. The smell hits you first. It's like someone slow-cooked old leather, sheep sweat, and damp wood smoke, then forgot to turn off the crock pot for a decade. The air is thick, warm, and heavy with the collective breath of 15 humans. 2 dogs, 5 chickens, and whatever is growing in the corners of the room. Welcome home. There are no windows. Just a smoke hole at the top of the longhouse that vaguely considers letting smoke escape, but mostly just invites freezing drafts and confused birds. You're under a fur blanket that smells like someone lost a battle in it last winter. Spoiler. They probably did. Oh, and there's no bathroom. If nature calls in the middle of the night, you're heading outside. In the dark, in the snow, with wolves, bears, and, if local legend is to be believed, the occasional reanimated corpse prowling the shadows. Don't trip over the firewood, and try not to scream. You'll wake Uncle Einar. He's not a morning person, or a night person, or frankly, a person you want to interact with ever. So, why are we here? Why are you shivering in the dark like a sentient meat popsicle, being aggressively spooned by your cousin and exhaling into an atmosphere that registers as 75% mammalian fog? Because this video is going to uncover the real sleeping conditions of the average Norse villager. And let's be clear, peaceful sleep was not a thing. Forget the fantasy of Viking dramas where broad-shouldered warriors cuddle beside roaring hearths, wrapped in pristine furs after a hard day's pillaging. The truth? Everyone was cold. Everyone was itchy. And no one, not the kids, not the adults, not even the gods, got a solid night's rest. But before we start, let me say, if you genuinely like my content, hit that like button and subscribe. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what you think about this topic. It's really awesome to see how far and wide our audience is on this channel. Tonight, we'll take you through the entire experience of what it actually meant to try to sleep in a Viking village. Not as a jarl or a shield maiden with plot armor, but as one of the 95% of Norse folk who spent their nights dodging lice, praying not to be raided, and contemplating whether that creaking sound was just a cow or something from Helheim. So, pull up your metaphorical fur blanket. It's crawling, by the way. Take a deep breath, hope you like lung soot, and settle in. We're just getting started. And spoiler alert, it gets worse. Ready to find out why no one ever truly slept peacefully in a Viking village? Let's get uncomfortable. Let's really dive in. You've survived the smell. You've accepted the livestock. But now, it's bedtime. And you're hoping, naively, that after a day of hauling water, chopping wood, and trying not to die, you'll at least get a decent night's rest. Well, I've got good news and bad news. The good news? You do have a bed. The bad news? It's basically kindling pretending to be furniture. For most Norse villagers, the bed is a makeshift structure. A few wooden planks raised slightly off the dirt floor, if that. On top, a lumpy mat filled with straw, reeds, or hay, whatever was left after the animals were fed. It's not soft. It pokes you. Constantly. Every shift you make is a new surprise jab from the underworld. You will wake up feeling like you've wrestled a hay bale. Because you have. And if you think that's the end of the discomfort, oh no. The bedding doubles as an ecosystem. Fleas, lice, and mites are regular bedmates. These little freeloaders thrive in your communal, body heat-fueled, barely clean environment. You don't just sleep. You scratch. Constantly. Until your skin feels like it's been exfoliated with gravel. Now, let's say you're really fortunate. Maybe you've done well raiding, or you're part of a decently off family. You might get furs. Actual furs. Not clean, not fluffy, but better than nothing. These blankets, often stitched together from scraps of animal pelts, are heavy, coarse, and retain the distinct aroma of something that once tried to maul a shepherd. They're stiff, crusted in sweat, and occasionally host their own ecosystem of lice. But they're warmish. Sort of. And here's the kicker. You're not sleeping alone. Viking households were communal. That means everyone, parents, children, elderly relatives, sometimes visitors, sometimes servants, all shared the same space. Privacy was a luxury nobody could afford. Picture this. 6 people on a single bedding mat, arranged like poorly cooked sausages, all huddled for warmth. Someone's elbow is in your ribs. Someone else's foot is mysteriously damp. And your cousin is sleep-talking in Old Norse about goats again. It gets worse. Come winter, livestock came inside. Not because Vikings were quirky animal lovers, but because the animal's body heat could help keep the longhouse above hypothermic levels. So yes, you are literally bunking with cows, and sheep, and pigs. And they're not potty trained. This creates what scholars like to call a rich olfactory environment. Translation: it smells like a barn floor dipped in wet socks. There's manure in the corners, animal hair in your mouth, and at least once a week, you'll wake up with a chicken standing on your chest, clucking, judging. Now let's talk about bed hierarchy. If you're the head of the household, or the chieftain, you get the warmest, driest spot, usually farthest from the door and nearest the hearth. If you're not, you're closer to the exit, where wind, snow, and smoke sneak in uninvited. Babies and children often slept between adults for warmth, which sounds sweet, until one starts wailing at 2 a.m. and triggers a chain reaction of ancient insomnia. There were no bed frames, no springs, no mattress toppers, no mosquito nets, although the bugs would have loved that. Some families might use a chest or a pile of clothes for a pillow. If you're lucky, your headrest doesn't give you splinters. If you're really lucky, you don't wake up with a beetle in your ear canal. Even the wealthiest Vikings had little more than a wooden sleeping alcove, a curtained-off nook raised from the floor. This was considered peak luxury. Imagine sleeping inside a wooden coffin with a burlap curtain for a door. And congratulations, you're living the Norse high life. And the idea of bedtime, not a thing. People went to sleep when the fire burned low, or the tasks of the day finally crushed them into submission. There were no bedtime rituals, no chamomile tea, no sound machines playing ocean waves. Just exhaustion and the constant hum of livestock, snoring, wind, and occasional howling from wolves. Or worse. So no, you didn't stretch out under the stars in a cozy fur blanket with a loving family and a full belly. You curled into a fetal position beside a leaking goat while praying your neighbor didn't roll over and elbow you in the throat. And this, my friend, was considered normal. Now, before you start building emotional bonds with your bedbugs, let's turn down the imaginary thermostat and talk about another delightful challenge. Cold. Relentless, bone-piercing, soul-sapping cold. Because if you thought the bedding was bad, wait until you see what happens when winter hits and the warmth disappears faster than a sober Viking at a mead hall. Signed. So you've accepted the bed isn't really a bed. You've made peace with the fleas. You've learned to coexist with Bjørn the goat. And just when you think you might finally drift off to a few hours of dreamless, lice-ridden unconsciousness, bam, cold. Not a little chilly. Not, let's throw on another blanket, cold. This is the kind of cold that feels like it's trying to become part of your skeleton. Like the air is actively attempting to extract your soul through your fingernails. Welcome to nighttime in a Viking village. See, Viking longhouses weren't built for comfort. They were built for survival. Barely. The thick timber walls and turf roofs were meant to trap heat, but mostly trapped dampness. There were no glass windows. No insulation. Just wood, dirt, and the occasional cow fart, trying to pass as thermal energy. In fact, the very construction of these longhouses ensured that whatever warmth you generated got sucked into the rafters, while the cold pooled comfortably at ground level, where you happen to live, breathe, and try to sleep. You think the fire helps? Let's talk about the hearth. The central hearth, essentially a long, smoldering ditch filled with embers and half-burnt logs, was the main source of light and warmth. During the day, it's great. At night, not so much. By midnight, it's mostly ash and sad little orange glows pretending to be fire. If you're not one of the lucky few sleeping right beside it, you might as well be lying outside. And rekindling it? That's someone's job. Usually the youngest or the most unfortunate. Enjoy fumbling with damp firewood while everyone else pretends to sleep. And speaking of outside, did I mention there's no such thing as central heating? Because there isn't. Instead, you're relying on two things to survive the Nordic night: body heat and prayers. You pull the animal furs tighter, curl closer to the human pile beside you, and hope your toes don't turn black by morning. If your nose isn't numb, you're doing something wrong. But it's not just the cold. It's the damp. The kind that creeps in under doors, through walls, and up from the earthen floor, like a swamp monster with a grudge. Your bedding absorbs it. Your clothes soak it in. Your bones learn to recognize it. Vikings didn't wake up refreshed. They woke up stiff, shivering, and coughing, like they'd spent the night licking river stones. The damp is omnipresent, like a clingy ghost that ruins everything it touches. Humidity hung in the air like a permanent ghost. And in winter, moisture from breath, livestock, cooking, and snowmelt had nowhere to go. It just lingered. Mold grew on walls. Straw rotted. Furs got heavier. Sometimes, your bedding froze. Literally froze. Imagine waking up to the sound of your blanket cracking. You pull it over your head, and it sounds like breaking pottery. Want to go outside to get fresh air? Sure, if if you enjoy navigating a frozen yard in the dark, wearing wool socks, and dread, forget slippers, you're barefoot, or in straw-stuffed shoes. Hope you don't trip over a sleeping sheep or slip on manure ice. And if you need the latrine, well, may the Norse gods help you. It's across the yard, buried in snow, and probably occupied by a frostbitten fox. And let's not forget seasonal darkness. In winter, daylight in Scandinavia could last as little as 4 hours. The rest of the time? Blackness. Not street lamp darkness. Not moonlight filtering through the curtains darkness. We're talking full on. Can't see your own hand. Someone just smothered the sun darkness. You don't know what time it is. You don't know who's awake. Time itself becomes a vague suggestion. Your brain doesn't like this. Neither did theirs. The lack of light and the biting cold combined into a psychological cocktail we'd now label seasonal affective disorder. Back then, they just called it living. Sleep patterns got weird. People often practiced segmented sleep, going to bed early, waking around midnight, then falling asleep again before dawn. Why? Because the cold, or the darkness, or the urge to stoke the fire, or, the goat, woke them up. Some even use that in-between period for prayer, crafting, or procreation. Yes, even then. Vikings were multitaskers. And in that middle-of-the-night twilight, you weren't safe. You might tend the fire, you might whisper prayers, or you might just lie there, wide-eyed, listening to every creak, every distant howl, every suspicious snort from the livestock, and wondering if that scratching at the door is a fox, or something worse. The Norse believed in spirits, both helpful and harmful, and the long dark nights were prime haunting hours. This wasn't just about comfort. It was about survival. The cold could kill. So could exposure to smoke, mold, or untreated respiratory infections from breathing in damp, smoky air every night of your life. Coughing wasn't just common. It was constant. Lung disease? Practically a household member. Still feeling nostalgic for the Viking lifestyle? Didn't think so. Next, we're adding another charming ingredient to this medieval mess. The uninvited guests who didn't need a door to ruin your night. They come with claws, spiritual baggage, and a profound disrespect for your boundaries. Let's talk about who's joining you in bed tonight. You've got your family, your livestock, a goat with intimacy issues, and of course, your uninvited, never leaving, perpetually rude roommates, fleas, lice, and the occasional ghost. Now, if you've ever had a mosquito in your bedroom, you know how one tiny insect can destroy your will to live. Imagine that. But the mosquito has a horde of cousins, never sleeps, and lives in your hair. That's Viking lice culture. Fleas and lice weren't just visitors. They were residents. Permanent ones. Embedded into the seams of your clothes. Living in your straw bedding. Snuggled into your furs. They didn't show up once in a while. They were part of your lifestyle. Think of them as the itchy, unwanted tax you paid for existing in the 9th century. You could try brushing them off, but they always came back. Like that one neighbor who just pops by and ends up staying 3 hours. Your bedding was essentially a living, crawling, biting petri dish. And the worst part? Nobody even found this surprising. It wasn't just tolerated. It was normalized. Everyone had lice. everyone had fleas. If you didn't, people assumed you were either cursed or dead. And you didn't even try to fight them. There was no shampoo, no hot water, no essential oil miracle sprays. If you were fancy, you had a comb. A nice bone or wooden comb. It was supposed to help remove lice. In reality, it just made you feel slightly less helpless as you continued your nightly ritual of itch, sigh, scratch, repeat. These critters weren't just gross, they were dangerous. They spread disease, caused open sores, and generally made every attempt at sleep feel like being trapped in a never-ending game of medieval whack-a-mite. You scratched until you bled, then scratched some more. And if you stopped scratching long enough to doze off, surprise, the mice chewing on your straw mattress made sure you didn't get too comfortable. But let's shift from the physical to the metaphysical. Because in the Norse world, you didn't just fear the crawlies. You feared the unseen. Let's start with the Draugr. You know how in modern horror movies, the dead come back to haunt the living? Vikings didn't invent that trope, but they definitely embraced it. The Draugr were undead spirits, corpse-like entities believed to rise from their graves and return to the village to harass the living. Reasons varied. Unfinished business, improper burial, or just being a general jerk in life and death. And where do you think they wandered? That's right. Your longhouse. Your bed. Your dreams. Your already paranoid midnight bathroom trip. Because when the cold wind howled through the smoke hole, and you heard creaking boards and shuffling feet in the dark, it could have been Uncle Hrolf getting up to pee. Or it could have been a Draugr coming to steal your warmth. And maybe your soul. To combat this, Vikings practiced all kinds of preventative rituals. Bodies were buried with stones to pin them down. Special items were placed under the tongue of the dead to keep them quiet. Graves were sometimes built with a corpse door, a one-time use exit through which the body was carried feet first, then sealed forever so the spirit couldn't find its way back. That's how seriously they took post-mortem home invasions. But wait, there's more. Apart from the Draugr, the night was filled with other ghostly threats. Felgjur, spirit guardians, could appear in dreams to warn of death. Older folk, forest spirits, could lure children and drunk farmers into the woods, never to be seen again. And then there were witches, shapeshifters, trolls, and assorted malevolent deities who, according to Norse belief, had nothing better to do than mess with you at 2 a.m. Some families lit protective fires. Others hung iron charms or carved runes into door frames to ward off spirits. Sleep wasn't just rest. It was a gamble with the supernatural. Forget sweet dreams. Vikings were aiming for, please don't be possessed tonight. Children were especially vulnerable. Many Viking parents left protective amulets under the bedding, or recited lullabies that doubled as warding spells. If you were a child in a Viking household, bedtime was basically a demon negotiation. The result? Sleep wasn't just a physical necessity. It was a nightly trial. You went to bed hoping for rest and praying nothing supernatural noticed you. Maybe you mumbled a few protective charms. Maybe you clutched a carved talisman. Maybe you just buried your face in your furs and whispered, "Not tonight. Please." Because between the real bugs biting your flesh and the imagined, but very real feeling ones, whispering your name from the shadows, peace wasn't part of the nightly routine. Still, sunrise always came. Eventually. And with it, the hope of a new day, and slightly fewer bug bites. Coming up next, we crank up the chaos and noise, because it turns out, even if you made peace with the bugs and the ghosts, the living weren't exactly restful either. Let's say, by some miracle, you've survived the cold, the bugs, the ghosts, and the goat. You've twisted yourself into the one remaining dry spot on the straw, found a breathing rhythm that doesn't sound like a dying bagpipe, and maybe, just maybe, you're about to fall asleep. Cue the chaos, because in a Viking longhouse, silence wasn't golden. It was extinct. First, you've got the neighbors. And by neighbors, we mean your entire family, crammed shoulder to shoulder in a single room. If someone turns over, you feel it. If someone sneezes, you taste it. And if someone snores, congratulations, you now understand what it feels like to live inside a drum. Snoring wasn't a gentle rumble. It was a full-bodied, wheezing, bear-fighting, a hornet's nest kind of ordeal. Multiply that by 5, maybe 10 people, each competing for the title of Norse sleep disturbance champion. The soundscape of Viking sleep was less lullaby, more livestock stampede meets asthmatic thunderstorm. And speaking of livestock, let's not forget them, because your sleeping quarters double as a barn. Chickens rustle above in the rafters. A sheep starts bleating at nothing. The cow lets out a belch that echoes off the roof beams. Every noise, every shuffle, every ungodly animal sound becomes your uninvited lullaby. But wait, there's more. Babies. Infant mortality rates were high, so Viking families often had multiple young children in the house at any given time, each one teething, hungry, sick, or spiritually convinced that sleep is a form of betrayal. Babies cried. A lot. There were no pacifiers, no white noise machines, no baby monitors, unless you count exhausted parents with one eye open and a prayer to Thor that the kid goes back to sleep. Then there were the rituals. Viking spirituality didn't come with an off switch. Every strange noise, illness, or unexplained fart could be blamed on an angry god. And when you suspected divine displeasure, you didn't sleep. You chanted. You banged drums. You made offerings. You lit torches. You did whatever it took to avoid waking up, cursed, hexed, or with a goat hoof where your door used to be. Religious observances, especially seasonal ones like Yule or harvest festivals, could last days. Think all-night chanting, horn blowing, and the rhythmic sound of people dancing in fur boots, while firelight flickered on every sweaty, soot-streaked face. No sleep for you. And if it wasn't the gods keeping you up, it was your fellow villagers. Arguments happened. So did coughing fits, late-night raids, drunken returns from the mead hall, or a spontaneous wrestling match between two brothers over who ate the last dried fish. And every single one of these events occurred in your bedroom. Because again, one room, no walls, no boundaries. Oh, and don't forget nature. Rain on the thatched roof, wind howling through cracks in the wood, wolves howling from the woods. Sometimes it was so loud, you wondered if the entire planet was trying to make sure you never reached REM sleep. And if, by some miracle, everything went quiet, just for a moment, you couldn't relax. Because silence meant something was wrong. Silence meant the fire had gone out, or someone had died, or something with glowing eyes was staring at the door. So you lay there, eyes wide open, muscles tense, listening, waiting, wondering if tonight would be the night someone stepped on a chicken, tripped over the kindling pile, and set the house on fire. In Viking villages, sleep was never guaranteed. Peace was always temporary. And silence was just the nervous inhale before something else exploded. Coming up next, even if you weren't jolted awake by snoring or spirits, there was always the looming threat of violent, unexpected visitors. Let's pretend for a second you've mastered the art of sleeping through lice attacks, screaming toddlers, and the bass-heavy symphony of communal snoring. Just as you're starting to enjoy a moment of semi-conscious bliss, boom. Not thunder, not a dream. That's the unmistakable sound of someone kicking in your door. Because in a Viking village, sleep wasn't just elusive. It was dangerous. And the number one nocturnal threat? Other Vikings. That's right. You didn't just raid foreign monasteries for treasure and entertainment. You raided your neighbors too. Rival clans, feuding families, or just opportunistic thugs looking for livestock, silver, or vengeance. And when did these raids usually happen? At night. Because if you're going to rob a family, you do it when they're disoriented, half-dressed, and still tangled in goat fur and existential dread. Most Viking villages weren't built like fortresses. They were clusters of longhouses, maybe with a fence if you were fancy, and a watchman if you were really paranoid. No security cameras, no locks, just a wooden door, maybe a latch, and the desperate hope that whoever's out there is too cold or drunk to follow through. Raids came swiftly. You'd be ripped from sleep by shouts, the sound of iron on wood, the scream of a chicken in distress, probably Bjørn again. And suddenly, your home becomes a battlefield. You don't have time to dress. You grab your axe, or your cooking ladle if that's closer, and try to make sense of the chaos. Women grabbed children. Men shouted orders. Everyone ran into the dark. And keep in mind, you're half asleep. Your only source of light is the hearth. And someone just threw a burning torch through your thatch roof. This wasn't just a fear. It was a constant one. Feuding was practically a sport. Grudges between families could last generations. A perceived insult, a land dispute, or a misjudged trade could spark retaliation. And retaliation didn't come in the form of a sternly worded letter. It came with fire and steel, and it often came after dark. Some raids were tactical, others were pure chaos. Raiders didn't always kill. They might just steal livestock, kidnap someone valuable, or leave a very pointed message in the form of a burned granary. But the unpredictability made it worse. You never knew what kind of destruction you were waking up to. And if it wasn't a human enemy, try nature. Storms could rip the roof off. Floods could swamp your food storage. A pack of wolves might decide your goat barn smells like dinner. Fire could start from a single spark and take out 3 houses before anyone realized what was happening. In winter, ice could shatter structures. In spring, rivers swelled and swallowed whole fields. There were no fire brigades, no emergency services. If disaster struck, your only alarm system was screaming, So what did people do? They slept in shifts. Some families took turns staying half awake, poking the fire, watching the door, checking for sounds outside. Kids were taught where to run if something went wrong. Weapons were kept close. Everyone knew the drill. If you heard shouts, run, grab, hide, fight. You didn't sleep peacefully. You slept like a soldier. One ear open, one hand on a blade, and a mental checklist of what to save if the roof caved in. Trust was not an option. Every shadow outside your door was a threat. Every lull in noise meant something was about to go wrong. And even if the night passed without bloodshed, you didn't relax, because the fear didn't vanish with the dawn. It just paused. Think of it like this. Your worst case scenario today is a power outage or a neighbor's car alarm. For a Viking, it was someone kicking your door in with an axe and setting your life on fire. So the next time your neighbor's wind chime wakes you up at 3 a.m., take a deep breath, roll over, and smile. Because at least you're not being raided by men with axes while clutching a screaming child and trying not to trip over a flaming goat. Coming up next, even if you survived the night, the longhouse itself was trying to kill you slowly, from the inside out. So you've survived the lice, the ghosts, the crying infants, and the occasional Viking wielding a torch. You'd think the longhouse itself, the literal roof over your head, might offer a little security, right? Wrong. Welcome to the Viking longhouse, a marvel of ancient engineering that managed to be both a shelter and a slow-acting execution device. It kept the cold out, the livestock in, and slowly cooked your lungs over the course of your life. Let's start with the fire. The heartbeat of the household and the ticking time bomb in your living room. At the center of every longhouse was the hearth, a smoldering pit of embers that did it all. Cooked your food, provided warmth, offered light, and filled the room with a delightful fog of smoke. That smoke had to go somewhere. But instead of chimneys, which hadn't caught on yet, you got a smoke hole. A tiny vent in the roof that was more suggestion than solution. On calm days, the smoke drifted out. On windy days, it swirled right back into your face like it had a grudge. And this wasn't the cozy, Instagram-worthy smoke that makes a fireplace look charming. This was thick, oily, eye-stinging smoke that clung to your clothes, coated the walls, and ensured that every breath came with a side of soot. You didn't just smell like fire. You tasted it. Your hair, your tunic, your goat. Everything reeked like a burned soup pot. Breathing in this smoke every single night wasn't just annoying. It was deadly. Historians and archaeologists now suspect many Vikings suffered from chronic respiratory issues. We're talking hacking coughs, black phlegm, and lungs that wheezed like broken bellows. Children grew up sounding like lifelong coal miners. Elders coughed themselves awake. You could hear a Viking longhouse before you ever saw it. Just follow the sound of wheezing. Now imagine trying to sleep in that. Your eyes are burning. Your throat is dry. Your child is coughing like a 60-year-old chain smoker. And somewhere in the corner, your grandma is muttering to Thor while fanning the fire with a chicken feather. But wait, things could always get worse. Because open flames and wooden houses don't mix well. Longhouses were constructed from timber and insulated with straw and turf, materials that just loved to catch fire. One spark out of place, one log that rolls too far, one overexcited toddler with a stick, and you've got yourself a full-blown inferno. And remember, there's no water bucket system, no fire department, and no escape plan. If a fire started at night, your only option was to scream, grab whoever you could, and run through thick smoke toward the freezing dark. And if the animals panicked, good luck. You haven't lived until you've tried to dodge a flaming sheep in a smoke-filled longhouse. Even when the house didn't burst into flames, it was falling apart slowly. Smoke blackened the beams, weakened the joints, and soaked into the roof. The walls were covered in grime. Soot settled on every surface. Furs reeked. The bedding felt like ash-scented sandpaper. And the air? It was like inhaling history's slowest funeral pyre. There was no ventilation, no air purification, just smoke, heat, and a slow simmer of mold building up in every damp corner. Your eyes were constantly irritated. Your skin felt dry and greasy at the same time. And let's not forget the creosote buildup, a lovely residue that could, if you were really unlucky, cause spontaneous chimney fires. But here's the twist. The hearth was sacred. It wasn't just a fire pit. It was the center of the home. Symbolically, spiritually, and practically, everything revolved around it. It was where meals were cooked, stories were told, rituals performed, ancestors honored. Letting the hearth go cold wasn't just uncomfortable. It was dangerous. Some believed it could invite bad spirits or divine wrath. So you kept it burning, even if it meant coughing up your lungs. Viking families worked around the fire like synchronized dancers. Wood had to be gathered daily. Ashes cleared. Embers stirred. Food prepared over uneven flames. Everything required a balance of constant tending and deep respect, like a wild pet that could kill you if neglected. So next time you complain about a smoky campfire or burnt toast setting off your smoke alarm, remember, Vikings had one room, one fire, no alarm, and the very real possibility that bedtime might include spontaneous combustion. Up next, even if you avoided asphyxiation, you weren't off the hook, because the concept of a normal schedule didn't exist, and your body was expected to function on broken rest and punishing labor. You've survived lice, gods, flaming goats, and a longhouse designed by someone with a deep hatred for clean air. So surely now you earn some well-deserved sleep. Wrong again. Because in a Viking village, if you weren't awake, you were working. And if you were asleep, it was probably by accident, curled around a bucket, still holding a hoe, face down in a sheepskin. Rest wasn't a right. It was a pause in between all the other things trying to kill you. Let's talk about Viking labor. It didn't clock in at 9 and politely clock out at 5. It was constant, relentless, and entirely dependent on the seasons, the weather, and the needs of everyone around you, including the chickens. Especially the chickens. A Viking day started before dawn. And by started, we mean it ambushed you. You were often up before the sun, fumbling through semi-darkness to stoke the fire, collect water from a freezing stream, or milk an animal that deeply resented your existence. Breakfast. A piece of dried fish and some sour ale. Eaten standing up while pulling on boots, if you were lucky. From there, your tasks depended on your role. Men? Off to the fields, or the fjord, or the forge, or to row themselves halfway across the sea to trade, raid, or or die trying. Women? Domestic management, which meant everything else. Weaving, cooking, cleaning, child rearing, food preservation, animal care, textile production, and still having time to pray. The house wouldn't burn down. And these were not side activities. These were daily grinds. Weaving wasn't a hobby. It was survival. You needed wool clothes to withstand the cold. And spinning, dyeing, and weaving fabric took hundreds of hours. Cooking? Nothing was fast. Bread required grinding grain by hand, mixing, shaping, baking over a fire that could scorch everything or refuse to heat at all. Even fetching water was an ordeal that could take a half an hour of icy tripping and praying the bucket didn't spring a leak. Children? Not an exception. By age 5, you were hauling water, chasing chickens, or learning to swing a tool that was only slightly smaller than you. Childhood was not a phase. It was unpaid training. By your teens, you were already a full participant in the brutal game of survival. And the labor didn't stop when the sun set. That's where segmented sleep came in. See, Vikings didn't follow our modern concept of 8 hours straight. They often practiced first sleep and second sleep, 2 periods of rest broken up by a chunk of late-night activity. During that in-between phase, they might mend clothes, pray, check the livestock, plot vengeance on a neighbor, or, yes, squeeze in a quick roll in the hay. Even their intimacy was penciled in between chores and fire tending. There was no sleep schedule. There was seasonal chaos. In summer, daylight stretched nearly round the clock, which meant working late into the night. In winter, darkness ruled, but that didn't mean you slept more. It meant you worked indoors by firelight, breathing in lungfuls of soot while your fingers froze. Sleep was never deep, never reliable, never without interruption. If the baby didn't cry, the goat probably stepped on your face. If the fire didn't die out, your cough would wake you up. And if none of those happened, congratulations. You probably forgot something, and now the butter's ruined or someone's missing a boot. The result? Chronic exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that doesn't make you yawn. It makes your soul feel like wet laundry. But there was no alternative. Everyone worked. Always. Because survival didn't come from comfort. It came from effort, endurance, and being slightly more stubborn than the environment trying to kill you. And even in downtime, there were expectations, social duties, storytelling, feasting, which, surprise, still involved hours of prep work, law, speaking assemblies, religious rituals. If you were lucky enough to sit down, someone would probably ask you to stand up and explain why your cousin's goat is grazing too close to the river boundary. Viking culture admired productivity, toughness, and resilience. Napping wasn't seen as restorative. It was suspicious. Laziness was a moral failing. If you were resting, it had better be because you were dead, or so injured that even the local healer with bone needles and fermented goat fat couldn't make you useful again. So yes, technically, sleep happened, but only because the body eventually gave out. Not because it was prioritized, and definitely not because you were done for the day. In Viking society, you were never done. Coming up next, let's dig into how even sleep followed a kind of pecking order, where your bedtime, your spot by the fire, and your right to rest all depended on who you were. So far, we've covered the cold, the ghosts, the fire, the bugs, the raids, the livestock, and the labor. You're sleep-deprived, soot-covered, emotionally scarred, and still half listening for wolf howls. But here's the kicker. Even the little sleep you got wasn't yours to control. Because in a Viking longhouse, not all sleep was created equal. Your ability to sleep, how much, where, when, and with whom, was all dictated by the social clock. And if you weren't high on that ladder, tough luck. You weren't just poor. You were tired and poor. Let's start with the layout. The longhouse was one giant shared space. At one end, the hearth. At the other, the door. And everyone else was crammed somewhere in between like meat in a smoky sandwich. Sleeping spots weren't handed out at random. They followed a strict, unspoken hierarchy. The head of the household? They got the best spot, next to the fire, in the warmest, driest part of the house. Maybe even a slightly raised sleeping platform. If you were someone important, like the Jarl, a respected elder, or a good blacksmith, you earned a place close to that sweet, sweet ember heat. But if you were a servant, a younger child, or some visiting cousin with nothing to offer but head lice and complaints, congratulations, you were shoved near the door. The draftiest, coldest, noisiest end of the longhouse. Also the first point of entry if raiders decided to drop by unannounced. Sleeping near the door meant waking up to wind, snow, or a confused pig. It also meant you were a human alarm system. If anything came in, it came through you first. Lucky you. This social clock also governed when you got to sleep. High-status members might turn in early. They could afford to. Everyone else? You stayed up tending the fire, completing late chores, or watching for signs of imminent disaster. Bedtime wasn't a thing. It was a privilege. Even space itself was rationed by rank. Better people got more of it. If you were lower on the hierarchy, you curled up. You folded in. You became a human Tetris block, squeezed between a squealing toddler and a sheep with halitosis. And let's talk noise and movement. If someone of higher status wanted to tell a story, start a ritual, or just loudly reflect on their latest ox trade, you stayed awake. You listened. You laughed. You nodded thoughtfully. No matter how tired you were. Because falling asleep before your superiors was rude and potentially dangerous if they decided you needed correcting. Even sleep posture had implications. Facing the fire was a sign of trust. Turning your back on someone could be interpreted as disrespect. If tensions were high, and they usually were, you might spend half the night faking sleep in the least offensive pose you could manage. The social clock was always ticking, always judging, and the consequences for stepping out of sync weren't mild. Being lazy or disrespectful, or even appearing to be, could earn you a spot in the rumor mill. Or worse, in the next feud. Sleep wasn't just rest. It was a performance, a ritual, a negotiation. And if you were a woman, your sleep was dictated by your marriage status, your fertility, your role in the household, and your general usefulness. Women often shared bedding with children, had to wake at night for nursing, and were expected to rise before the men to restart the fire and begin the day's chores. If you slept in, you weren't just lazy. You were failing your entire family. Elders were sometimes given better spots, not out of compassion, but because they were seen as bearers of wisdom and tradition. But if you were too sick or too slow, You might find yourself drifting further from the hearth with each passing season, both literally and figuratively. Guests were a wild card. A high-ranking guest might displace a family member from their usual spot. Hospitality demanded sacrifice. And you wouldn't complain, because honoring the guest meant upholding your family's reputation, even if it meant sleeping next to the goat. Religious roles played a part too. The godhi, priest, or any seeress held a unique place. They might sleep near sacred items, maintain ritual space, or even sleep separately if seen as spiritually charged. Their rest was seen as part of their mystical duties, not something to be interrupted unless absolutely necessary. All of this meant your sleep schedule was never about your needs. It was a reflection of your place in society. When you slept, where you slept, how well you slept. These were public facts, subject to interpretation and judgment. So yes, technically, everyone slept. But how you slept depended on who you were. And in a society where rank, ritual, and reputation were everything, sleep became yet another form of currency, and most people were broke. Coming up next, let's wrap it all together. The cold, the fire, the lice, the ghosts, the noise, the labor, the fear, and how they combined to create a world where peaceful rest was practically science fiction. Let's take a step back. You've now experienced Viking sleep in all its gritty, grimy, ghost-riddled glory. You've coughed through the smoke, itched through the lice, sweated beside a snoring uncle, and woken up to a half-burned chicken with abandonment issues. And you've done it all on a sleep schedule that seems personally designed to break your spirit. Still romanticizing the Viking life? Let's recap. Your bed wasn't a bed. It was straw, shared, damp, and alive with bugs. Your room wasn't a room. It was a barn with human accents. The air wasn't breathable. It was a lung-destroying soup of smoke, mold, and livestock breath. And sleep? Sleep was a precarious ritual negotiated with fire, disease, hungry ghosts, shrieking babies, angry gods, vengeful raiders, and the eternal draft seeping in under the door. There was no privacy. No your side. No mattress. No silence. No safety. Every part of the night was a gamble, and the house itself was part of the conspiracy. You either froze, burned, choked, itched, or were startled awake by a screaming child, a ritual chant, or a sheep chewing your sleeve. The social structure ensured even your rest wasn't really yours. If you weren't important, you slept near the door. If you were a woman, you slept with obligations. If you were a servant, you didn't sleep. You took shifts, keeping others asleep. And in the middle of all this, you had to work. Always. Sleep was just what happened when the body collapsed. It was neither sacred nor protected. It was tolerated. Now picture that night, after night. Not just for a week or during a particularly bad camping trip, but for your entire life. No vacations, no weekends, no moments of catching up on sleep. You didn't catch up. You endured. But here's the strange part. Despite all of this, they endured. They didn't sleep well, but they lived fiercely. They built, farmed, fought, traded, sang, worshipped, raised children, and carved myths into stone and memory. They braved the elements, the spirits, the plagues, the raids, and each other. So yes, maybe they didn't get 8 hours a night. Maybe they didn't have lavender-scented pillows or climate control. But they had resilience. A bone-deep determination to push through smoke, darkness, fear, and exhaustion to keep the fire going one more night, then one more, then another. That resilience, that refusal to collapse even when the world offered a dozen reasons to give in, is what made Viking communities survive. Not the sword, not the ship, not the long beard or drinking horn, but the ability to wake up every day, half slept, half sane, and go again. And maybe that's what we can actually admire. Not the fantasy, but the fight. So maybe don't envy the Viking lifestyle. Instead, appreciate your pillow-top mattress, your allergy-free sheets, your bugless bedroom, and the fact that your sleep isn't interrupted by smoke, ghosts, or someone yelling about goats at 2 a.m. Say thank you to your modern bed. And maybe also to the exhausted ancestors who made it through without one. Because if history has taught us anything, it's this. Sleep is a privilege. And Vikings? They were way too tired to enjoy it. Thank you for surviving this journey through a sleepless Viking village. Now, go get some rest. You've earned it.